This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Great, thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing, with discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Garlan Adams. Garlan is a consultant and a lawyer specialized in legal, regulatory, risk, compliance, and corporate culture matters, spending the majority of her time in the life science space. So thanks for being with us today, Garlan. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited about this topic. This week, we're talking about building and maintaining a culture of compliance. And I think that we've all probably heard those terms used before, but never really quite understand what it means and what it entails, what it looks like in action. So this should be a great conversation.
I hope so, yeah.
So Garlan, over the last decade, I have heard a lot about, hopefully our listeners also have heard a lot about creating a culture of compliance, as I mentioned in the intro. But I want to understand what that really means. So can you kick us off by telling us exactly what that is and why a company might want to achieve it?
Yeah, so a culture of compliance is really simple to describe. It's an environment in which people do the ethically correct thing while also following all the regulatory rules. The problems, of course, come when you break down those parts, right? So ethical by whose standards and from whose point of view? And do we define ethics based on social norms or our own personal morality? Or is there some other standard? And then when you layer on the regulatory rules, which, our current situation, really highlights, those rules can change. They can conflict within themselves, within our industry. And that makes people's personal sense of ethics or acceptable behavior might not necessarily be compliant behavior. Right. So every company within life science wants to do the right thing for patients, employees, stockholders, regulatory bodies, all the other constituents impacted by our products. But of the four that I specifically mentioned just now, each of those has their own perspective of what right looks like, and their perspective can change. And so that's where the culture of compliance gets really tricky. It's easy to say and much harder to do. And so when I sort of boil it down and talk to people, I think the consensus among biotech and pharma folks is that a culture of compliance is when employees are expected to know the rules, they follow them, and they do it regardless of whether anybody's watching. That's a huge task. And when you've gotten there, it feels really good.
Right. I can imagine. I mean, I definitely can see, though, how this would be a really hard thing to enforce or to even define, being that there are so many different viewpoints, and there's so many different experiences that people come at it, from. And the way what you think is ethical might not be the same thing that I think is ethical. So, I mean, it's definitely got that human component to it, right? That can just really make it a tough thing to monitor, I guess, or to achieve. And my guess is that even if you have these written commitments to do the right thing from the top down, like the CEO and the COO and the CFO, they're all singing the same tune. That sounds really great in theory. It might even look really good on your letterhead or on your website. But as I mentioned, the human factor means there's always room for error, I can imagine. So can we connect these errors or deviations to countless citations and regulatory findings in pharmaceutical industry? Because we hear a lot about things that were just blatantly done wrong in life sciences, and I'm trying to make the connection between the two here. What do you think?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but yes. And as someone who spent their career within life sciences, it's very frustrating. When the pharma and biotech space is characterized as sort of the villain. When we are creating life-saving and life-changing medicines for people. But I do scratch my head, and all of us do, in sort of how are we still reliving the same lessons? I'll pick on easy ones about speaker programs or failure to market within the four corners of the label. All of our policies for years and years have described those rules. But unfortunately, there are still too many examples of enforcement based on these, very basic. So if you look at 2017, 2018, 2019, the DOJ recovered 3.7, 2.8, and $3 billion with a B for settlements and judgments associated with alleged violations of False Claims Act. So what's driving these outcomes year after year, even though our policies all say what our rules are? And I think about companies, and I literally cannot think of a single company that encourages employees to do the wrong thing. We're always encouraging our employees to do the right thing.
Right.
We don't have a policy or procedure, that says do the right thing unless it's, inconvenient. Nobody has that.
Right.
All of these companies have great policies. They have great procedures describing the rules of the road. We all tout ourselves as having high ethical standards as the foundation of our company cultures. But I think that the dissonance comes when we talk about this culture of compliance, and at the same time, we've somehow normalized what's a so-called natural tension between results-driven performance culture and compliance-focused behavior. We've normalized that those two things clash. And what I would challenge, folks in my space or in the regulatory and compliance say, how can we make doing the right thing the actual result, the end result? That's the real that we're all after.
Yeah, right. Because I like to think, like you said, nobody has a policy that says, hey, we're all going to do the right thing if you want. And I also think
exactly.
But I also think on the flip side of that, when you think about the employee, the person coming into work every day, I don't think that the majority of us wake up in the morning heading to work saying, I'm going to do the wrong thing today, or, hey, you know what? I'm going to mess this up so others can't benefit from it. So, I do feel like that. And yet we see it happening over and over and over again in highly regulated industries. So from what I'm taking from you, is your thought on this, that the biggest factors then are they're not rewarded to do the right thing? Or, can you explain that a little bit?
I don't know if it's about reward and recognition. I mean, we always going to come back to, what was the incentive and what was the punishment. I think at the end of the day, you're exactly right. The bad guy, there are bad guys out in this world. We all have to sort of wake up and accept that. But those aren't the real problem. Those aren't the couple of bad guys aren't resulting in $3 billion settlements.
Right.
Within our highly regulated industries, I would argue that there are challenges to compliant behavior. And it's a strange thing to hear a lawyer and compliance person say that, but the regulations are complex and they're always changing. And the expectations of those we serve are fluid and diverse and sometimes conflicting. And so we try to solve for this with training our people and communicating the rules and creating technology and rewarding or punishing results. And I think all of those things are great first steps. Mm-hmm. I think those things are all required. But I also think that ethically correct and compliant behavior within the real world requires lots of training and practice. I recently listened to a fantastic TED Talk. It's another podcast that's not ours, but I listened to a fantastic TED Talk from Barry Schwartz, and he talks about the loss of wisdom. And I'm sort of addicted to this talk. It's fascinating. And he talks about the combination of moral will and moral skill, and how it's so much harder in the real world to know when to make exceptions to the rules.
Right.
How do we know, and how do we teach each other to find ethical and compliant solutions appropriate to the particular situation we're faced with? And so I think it always goes back to how we define our goals within a company. So if our number one goal for the year is our sales figures, then by definition, we're instructed to prioritize making sales.
Right.
No one says break the rules if you must or cut corners, but what naturally follows is that every segment or region, or however we divide up sales, prioritizes hitting their sales numbers.
Sure.
That leads to each individual making that same choice. What happens if maximizing our sales number this year conflicts with our long-term company goals? That's where I think most people would vote for long-term company goals.
Right.
Even over their own individual goals. And that we should prioritize that over a particular segment or particular individual's goals. And I'm just picking on sales because I think it's easy, but we can talk about the conflicts within research development or any other places.
I think
but my challenge is, what would decision-making look like if our long-term goal is to build trust among our employees, shareholders, patients, and regulatory bodies? If that's our goal, it's a difference in framing, but I think that the difference in words really can sometimes matter.
I would agree. I would definitely agree. I mean, I think that unfortunately, whether it's a company or a group of individuals within a company, say a sales team, like you mentioned, they can focus so heavily on other aspects of a decision, whether it's profitability, hitting a deadline, winning a new contract, and the list goes on, that they neglect to check for the ethical or moral benchmarks, right?
Yeah.
And so, in your mind, are pressures that these people might feel as a group or as an individual, typically from the top down, I would think, or are they usually internal drivers or something else altogether? What's been your experience with that?
I think it's a confluence of all the factors. I mean, most of us are hardwired, to win. So, I don't want to say that winning is sort of the bad word here. So we're hardwired to win. We're hardwired to want our teams to win, to want our companies to win. And so, that's in there. We're also hardwired to believe the best about ourselves and our team and our coworkers. And the tone at the top, it sets that tone, but that's nothing without an engaged execution team. And, we talk about sales, and I do pick on them sort of in my conversations with people a lot, just because of the face of our companies. Sure. But we can just as easily talk about conflicts within research and development. So in biotech, we have to get molecules in development, product and studies. Speed and efficiencies are critical to hitting the traditionally structured annual goals, right?
Right.
We have to get X number of people enrolled in study A as our set priority. Patient safety and dedication to science is paramount, immutable. We don't even talk about that as one of our goals. But should we? That's my question.
Yes.
And so I love the explanation that's contained in the research about ethical fading. And their theory there is that people sometimes fail to acknowledge when they're making a moral or ethical decision. And I think that's the explanation that makes the most sense to me, that it's neither the external or internal drivers that are causing people to betray their own ethical codes or the codes of their team or their company. I buy into the theory that people don't see the ethical betrayal or the choices they're making as they're happening.
That's interesting. I had heard you mention ethical fading previously, and I kind of looked into it as well so that I could have an understanding of that. And basically, what I got was a definition that's something like an erosion of the ethical standards of a business or an individual, which can cause an employee to engage in self-deception. I thought that was very interesting. So, and it sounds to me like you're saying they basically become blind to it, or they just fail to see, right, what's right in front of them, whatever component of the decision it is that they're wrestling with. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think I find the argument, incredibly fascinating because, it's hard to think the authors are wrong. We trade off sometimes between self-interest and corporate goals or our internal moral principles. But at the same time, like I said, we're wired to believe ourselves to be moral, ethical people. The bad guy, I'm a huge fan. So the bad guy in any sci-fi movie, never says I'm the bad guy. They say I'm doing this for the betterment of something else, right? So, we always we deceive ourselves about those times when we choose between self-interest and the morally correct thing to do. The white lie is the easiest example I can think of. Lying is wrong, but, telling someone that their quarantine haircut looks awful is worse.
Right.
So we consider ourselves to be more kind as we break our internal ethical rule about lying. We all have that rule. Lying is wrong. But if it's a white lie that's kind, it's okay. And so we can think about these examples of self-deception that can happen.
Sure.
And we do it with language, when we describe non-combatant deaths as casualties, or we talk about reallocation instead of layoffs. For me personally, downsizing is my favorite example of the self-deception that occurs. We as a company are making a prioritization choice.
Right.
To even frame it as a choice feels very offensive. I've been on leadership teams when we've had to make this choice, but it is a choice. And it's what we have to do to survive or invest in our future. But we could miss this year's number and we could drive the stock price down. Right. Which are we gonna do? We might lose our company. And I've served on leadership teams during those times and have seen the cultural impact of having the fully aware, fully transparent conversation versus the self-deceived one. It's a really powerful tool as a leader to have the transparent conversation about the sometimes impossible trade-offs we have to make rather than pretend that we're powerless in making them.
That's a great point. I mean, it really is a great point. Sometimes it's just too hard to do the right thing,
Yeah.
And as people, we look for the easier way out or the kinder, gentler way out, to your point before.
Yeah.
And because
it's an uncomfortable conversation.
It is.
But discomfort is the source of innovation and change, right?
Right. And so to that point, as you are attempting to build a corporate culture where responding with the ethical action is expected, the appropriate behaviors are continuously modeled, and doing the right thing is consistently rewarded, means that everyone has to support and participate in the policy, in the protocol. Right. Yeah. So, and I know that like we mentioned at the beginning, that can be tough to define and enforce, but where in the chain of command, being that you are familiar with leadership teams and the tough decisions, where in the leadership chain of command does this begin? Who's ultimately responsible, for the actions of all?
Everyone. I fully believe that it's everyone. You have to have an engaged workforce who, takes it as their personal mission to do the right thing, regardless of who's watching. And it's structural, it's institutional, it's systematic. And as leaders, we have to be consistent with our messaging, our behavior, our reinforcement tools. But as every individual, we have to view ourselves as, every day we're either showing up and demonstrating the culture we want to live in, or we're not. Right. And the days that we're not, having the horrible, hard conversation to say, today I didn't live up to what I wanted to do, either, self-reflectively or as a team, and then course correcting, right? That's where having building the sort of moral conversations as the checkpoint rather than, what's the policy say? Well, the policy may say all kinds of things, but what are you doing and showing up as every day?
Sure.
And for me, that's where I think it's crucial that it's everyone engaged.
And I would agree with that. I think, like I mentioned, you have to have the buy-in from everyone. So in creating a corporate ethics and compliance program, what type of training or employee engagement is needed, do you think, to really kick something like that off?
I have seen, tremendous successes within organizations when people actively ask permission when improvising a solution. If there's something that's not described in the policy or procedure, having the conversation, practicing, giving people permission to fail. Again, it's crazy for a lawyer and a compliance person within pharma to say, give people permission to fail, because there's really no room for live failures. So we've built in the control points as the fail safe. I'm one of those control points, right? Lawyers and regulatory professionals and compliance teams review almost everything within our industry.
Right.
And we specialize in knowing the due dates for reporting adverse events or how to document procedures. So we're experts in the compliance with regulatory requirements piece of the puzzle.
Right.
And if that's all it took, we wouldn't be having this conversation, frankly.
Exactly.
But in my experience, the blips come when those folks are not serving as the expert advisors, but instead are the enforcers or the police. And the biggest red flag when creating a compliance program is if the employees view compliance as just a department or as someone else's job. And so, sort of to take it in a little bit, I'll never forget being at an all-company meeting. It was a new company that I had just joined, and an employee asked an off-label question of the CEO, brand new CEO, first time as a CEO, and the moderator of the sales meeting was a little bit nervous and automatically started to hand the microphone over to me because we've got this off-label question in the middle of our all-company meeting. The CEO stopped them. Before they handed me the microphone, it was a very awkward moment. He stopped, the moderator as the person was handing me the microphone, and he said, we all know that this question is off-label. If any of us needed Garlan to help clarify that, we shouldn't be in this room. It was a big moment. It was pause and crickets and awkwardness, but it set the tone within that company. Every single person at that all-company meeting understood in that moment that the expectation was that everyone had the responsibility to know the basic rules of the road. And so that, was years and years ago. And I still think about that CEO and I think about that. And so for me, the key to your question is what type of employee training or engagement is needed. And the answer is always engagement. Normalize compliant behavior within everyone's day. And even if you have to make it this sort of awkward, momentous, in the middle of a national meeting, grabbing the microphone moment, it sticks and it was important and powerful. And so take those moments to really set the stage with people of what the expectations are and model it.
Yeah, I love that example because I think sometimes it is that jolt that people need to understand, like, we're serious about this and this is the expectation, like no ifs, ands, or buts, right? And he didn't have to say that, but that spoke volumes, I would imagine, to everyone in the room.
Well, there's a big difference when you model that it's everyone, when you model that it's everyone's responsibility to be compliant versus handing it off to a compliance department, so that it's only those people down the hall who have this as their responsibility. Right. I would argue for a culture where everyone understands that the doing the right thing all the time is always every employee's responsibility, right?
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And so I have a follow-up question too, because you mentioned, the compliance department, and for so many in the life science space, compliance people are, to your point, focused on, did we meet the regulatory standards? Are we ready for the audit review, et cetera? So this function seems so far outside of that type of compliance to me that I'm wondering, does this task fall to someone on that team, or is this more of a human resources or a legal counsel function? Because I'm not sure. How can you tie it in to the quality standards and protocols that are already adhered to internally, for these other purposes, but make it a universal rule, universal benchmark?
Well, I think it's exactly as you described. Yes, it absolutely falls to the lawyers and the compliance and regulatory professionals, to really outline the specifics of what those rules are, or what those dates are, or, what form it needs to be on, all of the really nitty gritty particulars. But when it comes down to making judgment calls, we have to build within our teams, a sense of wisdom, right? So it is that ability to, know what the basic rules are, know when to ask, flag those issues. And that depends on each individual. For those of us within, sort of the structure of compliance, if you will, since we all own compliance, but for those of us in sort of the structure making, that's our job to make it part of the integral part of everyone's job.
Right.
So, as part of what you do every day, let's build in the things that I would need to see, that I need to report on an annual basis, to the government for whatever reason, or whatever that may be, build into the system, build it into people's natural day. That's what our job as compliance and regulatory and lawyers are, is to build it in and make it integrated. And then the folks who are doing their, quote unquote day job, it's just part of their day job.
Right.
But it's up to us to help integrate those things and make them make sense for everyone on their day.
Absolutely. And they need to be practiced over and over, so they're habit, right? So people just don't, they don't have to think about it because it's just automatic, and
absolutely.
You can get to that point. This is a fascinating topic. This is a fascinating topic because, we're so used to in business, especially regulatory business, in the black and white of things. And this is, all of this takes place in the gray, right? It all takes place.
It does.
And it's tricky. It can be tricky. So Garlan, in summary, what do you believe to be the key elements then of a corporate ethics program? And maybe if you can help us understand what the first steps are to integrating this into an existing corporate culture. Yeah.
So as you said a minute ago, the first, second, third, fourth step must be practice. Writing a code of conduct is really critical, but engaging people in the discussion about who we are as a company and within our industry and how we are going to demonstrate that, reinforcing what the expected behavior looks like, actively reward those who are living the culture that you desire. And so I'll give you another couple of examples. I love the big national meeting examples because there's thousands of people in the room, and you can literally sort of watch as the culture changes in those moments.
Right.
And so I was once in a national sales meeting, probably 1,000 people there. And the head of commercial brought up as the number one rep someone who hadn't completed their training, whether it was compliance or HR or product training, hadn't done any of their training on time. Budget expense reports was a nightmare to the person's coworkers. And I watched the mumbles around the room in this room of 1,000 people as people digested the message of the day. And the message of the day was that sales numbers were more important than anything, including how you treat your coworkers.
Right.
That was a powerful message. I can tell you the other side of that story. At a different sales meeting, I saw the head of sales bring the HR recruiter, somebody who thinks they're just doing their job, and brought them in and highlighted them as the most valuable player on our team because they had recruited and retained so many talented people and had been training the team. And when he called that person the year's most valuable player, there weren't mumbles. There was a standing ovation for the HR recruiter that day. And to this day, I know what was valuable to that person and within that company. And we as leaders and as people managers have to look for and execute and practice those moments all the time. It's practice, practice, practice.
And as a team lead, a manager, or a C-suite executive, I think it's really you really need to stop and think about the message you're sending before you send it, because I think that's such a critical lesson that those people unfortunately learned, in that meeting that day that you just spoke of, that hitting your sales goals was far more important than than doing what's required of you otherwise at the office. And it's certainly far more important than being part of a team.
Yeah, I think what the thing that's critical and the habit that we have to, get ourselves in is, building trust within our teams to highlight, those moments where there may be some self-deception, where we're using euphemisms instead of, the hard, uncomfortable words, where we're talking about what would it look like if we made a different choice in those moments, right? And so to highlight, back to sort of the concept of ethical fading, right? Highlighting those moments when it might be occurring. You don't see it as it's happening. You don't, people oftentimes, don't catch these things while they're going on. But can we be each other's guide and have that trust within leadership teams to pause and say, is this the right thing to do? Is there another side to this? Are we using the right words to describe the decisions that we're making? And those are tough conversations, but frankly, I think that's the stage we're in, both as an industry and particularly in a compliance and regulatory space. Writing more procedures isn't the solution. Having a different conversation, I think, is the solution.
And so, just before we close, and do you think we are doing with that as an industry? Are we
we're doing fantastic
stages, or are we in the middle, or is this what you're seeing as sort of the norm right now?
I think it's very quickly becoming the norm. We have lots of really good conversations going on about how do we embed and build in and make it easier for people to do the right thing, right? So how do we make compliance the easiest thing to do? How do we make turning in your expense report on time? And I pick on compliance not from the perspective of just regulatory compliance, but we have our own internal company policies we have to follow. We have to turn in our expense reports on time.
Right.
So, using that as the example, how do we build in within our system a way to make it easier for people to do that? How do we build that into part of their day that it's not something that's layered on top of their normal day? Those are the kinds of things that we're seeing a lot of really great work in terms of systems and structure. And, we've got the policies, we've worked on the policies, we've worked on the culture. And so the systems and structures are coming in to sort of layer on. And I think we'll be in this cycle of improving on each other, improving on the policies, improving on the procedures, get a better system, get, all these things all work together. And I think we're on the right path of having that synergy to rely on the best in people. I don't ever, my motto within my space has always been, the person who wants to be the bad guy and who starts his day saying, I want to do the wrong thing, I can't, mitigate that person. All I can do is that person a different industry to be in.
Yeah.
But what I can do is help the people who maybe don't see, the ethical problems or the regulatory problems or the compliance problems, help them to navigate their way through those in an easier way.
I think that's great. I mean, we want to ultimately help each and every one of our employees to be the best employee they can be and the best, whatever their job is, engineer, compliance, whatever person they can be. Right. And I think it does start with having that expectation
absolutely
as a company. That everyone is going to do the right thing. They're going to be supported in doing the right thing, and they're going to be given the tools to do the right thing.
Absolutely. And, the thing that is true, sort of regardless of any of the titles that you just referenced. The thing that I think is all those folks that think long term. If we think big picture, the ethical dilemmas that may seem big moment become very, very small, and it's easier for us to make the right choice. And so I love that we're having lots of conversations right now about building for the long term, about bigger, more audacious goals. And the only way to do that is to sort of take the lens back and really do some strategic long-term thinking, which then leads to, better choices when it comes to compliance.
Right.
Because the long term, the payoff is so obvious with compliant behavior versus not compliant behavior, right?
Absolutely.
And so getting that long-term view, I think, is one of the most valuable things that's going on right now.
I would agree. And I love the idea of thinking long-term. I mean, that's what we're doing when we're thinking about the quality of our drugs, or our medical devices. So why not think of it in terms of our people as well?
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, Garlan. I learned a lot, and I think that our listeners will really appreciate all of the information you brought here. So I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's been amazing to have you, and I look forward to hopefully doing an update at some point in the future to get maybe a few more case studies and really understand how this is working effectively in some larger companies. So thanks.
That'd be fantastic. I'd love to.
Yeah, that's great. I want to say also a big shout out and thank you to our producer, Ben Kitchen, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And lastly, a big thank you to you, all of our valued listeners. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that. And also, if you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode. And don't forget to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks, because that's how we grow, and we certainly do appreciate that. So for today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.